Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I think we're ready to get underway here. I know there will be some other people who will be coming later because of our continued cold weather. And then I don't know about you, but I was really surprised in the parking garage. I mean, you know, there are no classes today here at the U, and yet the lot was really, or the garage was really full. I just found that pretty incredible. Such devotion on the part of university staff. That's the University of Minnesota working for. Here's Julie. She's going to
start at noon.
Oh, they do start at noon today. Oh, okay. Thank you, Julie. Again, I want to welcome you on behalf of the Minnesota Achievement Gap Committee. My name is Grant Abbott. I have the privilege of co-convening with the founder of this organization, Don Frazier, who is over there. And if you were looking at the paper this morning, I believe it was in the Star Trib, there was a nice article about Matthew Little of blessed memory, who has just died. But there's a picture of Don with Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy and Matthew Little and others getting ready for the 1963 March on Washington. So Don has been about this work for, shall we say, at least 50 years? So we're very fortunate that he had the vision to create the Minnesota Achievement Gap Committee. And we're really just honored that 12 of the major education reform organizations would take time out over a condensed 3 weeks to be able to present to you, and then through our website and the videos that we make of this, to provide people with an opportunity to see the breadth of what is being suggested for reform and those areas where there is potential agreement, where the organizations could work together on a problem that sometimes seems insoluble, though we are making progress. But we know here in Minnesota, we haven't got time to mess with this anymore. I mean, if we want our children to have the kind of life that my generation experienced in Minnesota, we've got a lot of work to do in a very, very short time. So I'm really pleased for all of you to be here today. I'm a resident of St. Paul, so I'm very pleased to see two of our school board members are here from St. Paul. I'm trying to see if there are school board members from Minneapolis. I'm not seeing anybody right now. But Chu Vu and Ann Carroll are here from the St. Paul School Board. Thank you very much. I believe there are some legislators that are going to be coming and other folks who will be here. And so I want to introduce to you now the panel for this morning, and then once I get done with these brief introductions, they will begin. They will come up here to the podium to deliver their 15-minute presentation, and at the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions. We have people who have 3x5 cards. If you'll raise your hand at various times, they will come by and make sure you get a card to put your question on. They will bring the question to me, and at the end, I will try to ask as many questions as possible. I can't guarantee that I can ask all of the questions. There's information over here on the side, and we try to keep that going each Tuesday. So let me introduce first, on my right is Dr. Gary Amoroso, who is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Association of School Administrators. And to his right is Jim Bartholomew, who's the Education Director for the Minnesota Business Partnership. And to his right is Jennifer Godinez, who is the Associate Director of the Minnesota Minority Education Partnerships and an advisor to the College of Education and Human Development here at the University of Minnesota. And Namila Sitati, who is with the Organizing Apprenticeship Project, and this is her title. She'll say more about this when she comes up here. But she is the Education Equity Rubric Pilot Project Coordinator. If you need me to repeat that, if you need to write that down. But it's an honor. These people have been working long and hard on this, and it's a privilege for us to be able to hear from them. Dr. Amoroso.
Grant, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Achievement Gap Committee for allowing us to come up and share some thoughts. I'm as excited about learning today. I'm even more excited about learning from the other distinguished speakers. Had an opportunity to review the presentations that were provided last week, and we'll review the presentations that are provided during the next session. One of the things that we've been trying to stress over the last year is the need to collaborate. And Grant and I were chatting a little bit before the presentation, and there's a vision for this process, not to be 3 presentations and an ending point, but a vision to truly have this be a beginning point and then look at how can we come together. And that's one of the things that I'm going to mention in my time is the challenge of drawing people together to create a common agenda on behalf of children. I think we've become polarized in this country to the point where education is now a battleground. And my personal opinion is that that's not a good thing. I think education's got to be something that we all strongly believe in, that we all have a vested interest in, and I think we have to work hard, regardless of what our political affiliation is, regardless of our backgrounds, but work hard to find the common ground to benefit children. Because one of the things I learned, this is my 37th year in the business of education. I was a teacher right up through the ranks. I took the traditional route, teacher, building level administrator, district level administrator, superintendent for 15 years, now the honor of serving as the executive director of this association. But the thing I realized, and I still hold dear, is that every child only has one opportunity. We can't wait 5 or 10 or 15 years to fix the problem. Our children are here now. They're going to be coming every day. They'll be coming every year. And so we've got to continually work. It's kind of like building the plane as you're flying it. But our children are relying on us. They're relying on us to come together in their best interest. So for those that may not have a good sense of who we are, the Minnesota Association of School Administrators really is the organization that represents the superintendents in the state, curriculum directors, special ed directors, other district level administrators. We have service cooperative employees that are part of our association. We have some college faculty. And truly, 2 main areas of purpose. One is to advocate on behalf of children at the legislature in Minnesota and at the the Congress in Washington, D.C. We serve as a registered lobbyist. I work with Jim a lot at the Capitol. And one of the things we do is try to advocate for legislation that we believe is in the best interest of the children of the state. Secondly, we provide services to our members, services ranging from providing professional development opportunities at a state level, regional level, district level, to doing other types of support work for them to help them be successful in what they do. We were asked to look at 3 questions, so I'm going to stay with the 3 questions, and I may stray a little bit. The first question was, how do we understand the achievement gap? And one of the things that I'll lead off with is that I believe it's not a simple issue. It's a broad issue. It's an issue that I believe goes across our society. I think when we talk about achievement gap, a lot of people like to look at the schools and say, fix it. Schools, fix it. It's your responsibility. You have those kids in your buildings from 8 until 4, make them better. I truly believe that the issues associated with what helps create the achievement gap is much broader than the child's educational experiences. I'm seeing more and more research that talks about the connection with poverty, socioeconomic status. And that's not a K-12 or pre-K-12 issue. That's a societal issue that we have to have people come on board with. I recently read an article by Sojourner and Duncan. It was in the Journal of Human Resources. It was September 21st, 2013. I'll give you the title, but if you just would put it into your browser, Sojourner and Duncan, it would come up. It's intensive early childhood intervention programs eliminate income-based cognitive and achievement gaps. And basically, it supported the thoughts that I had about this not just being an issue that's a school-based issue. You have our children that generally can access early childhood programs at age 3 and above. You have kindergarten either at age 5 or 6. You got the K or the 112 system. But this article interestingly states that they believe that the achievement gap truly begins at birth. And in those first 3 years of life for that child, that is where the gap takes place. That's where it begins. That's where the seeds are planted for having one child have a certain set of experiences that will lead to development, and another child having a different set of experiences that leads to a different level of development. And so this isn't just about K-12. We have a role to play, no doubt about it. But I want to challenge us to think about this more as a societal issue, and how are we going to address it? There are no magic bullets. If there was a magic bullet, somebody would have bottled it, sent it out, and been a millionaire. There are no magic bullets to get this job done. It's going to take a lot of hard work, it's going to take commitment, and it's going to take a society, an entire society, an entire country saying, we are no longer going to accept it. So how do we get rid of it? How do we eliminate the gap? Again, this is something that I think involves everyone. In that article that I mentioned, the authors portray the fact in their minds that if every child who was impoverished under the age of 3 received intensive interventions from birth to 3, that when those children walked into our systems as pre-K-12 educators and into our systems, there would be no achievement gap. They're saying that the experiences, the supports that you could gain from birth to age 3 would put everybody on an equal footing. We'll talk about what's that cost in a few minutes. Our state, last year, I think did some good things. Our legislature, I thought, and I do want to recognize we have Senator Uyghur, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and I apologize if there are any other legislators here, but Senator Uyghur was a leader last year in working with his committee, in working with the House, in working with the governor to pass an education bill that provided an additional, somewhere in the area of $485 million to schools over this year and next year. And the thing that I really felt helped us in terms of achievement gap, which goes with the research, is we created early learning scholarships for children 3 and above, about $40 million over the biennium, as well as we are now going to be funding all-day kindergarten for school districts starting next year. And so when we talk about what's the answer, there is no one answer. What are we going to do to help children from birth to 3? I think there's an answer there that needs to be found. What are we going to do with children that are preschool in that 3, 4, and 5 range? Then what are we going to do when children hit the school of their choice when they go into kindergarten or first grade? So I think it's multiple layers have to be addressed. Other legislation that's been passed in the last couple of years for the early primary ages is the Learn Well to Read by 3rd grade. Again, this came through the legislature. It causes every school system in the state to create to create a literacy plan for the children. We've seen some positive results. There's been some progress in reading and math with the younger children. Where we aren't seeing enough progress, in my opinion, is as the children continue to go through our systems into the middle years and the high school years. And that continues to be a challenge. What are some of the barriers to moving forward? I'll start with money because money is always talked about. This is not the only barrier. It may not even be the most important barrier, but I shared with you the concept from the journal article. We're providing support resources for every child impoverished from birth to age 3 would help to eradicate the achievement gap for those children, the cost of that would be anywhere between $29,000 to $49,000 per child. So of course, the question is, where would those dollars come from? Where would those dollars come from? Probably the most important question is, will society take up the challenge? Is it important enough that this would become a national priority? Tonight, I believe we have President Obama's State of the Nation. I wonder where education will be mentioned in that address. What part of the address will he spend on education? Will it come before foreign affairs, after foreign affairs? Will it come before, after the economy? All kinds of things. But will we as a country truly decide that the most important aspect of a democracy is truly an educated populace? And if we truly believe that the most important aspect of a democracy is an educated populace, then why isn't that priority one? And if it is, then maybe we can truly, as a society, begin to attack the issue. One of the challenges, can't ignore our economy, the national economy, the state economy. We've had challenges the last few years. Our associations fully recognize that. We know the states had to make tough decisions. We know the feds have made tough decisions. I believe that if our economies aren't strong, attacking this issue is going to be even more challenging. In summary then, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we have a platform. Every year, our association has a platform. We go to Senator Uyghur, we go to the other members of the House and the Senate, we go to the governor and say, here are the things we think is what's best for the children of Minnesota. And we try to find partnerships with other organizations within education, outside of education, because what we're trying to do is break down the silos. What I just said, I would hope would go away someday. It shouldn't be education organizations and educations outside of organization. It should be all of us caring about kids. And what we're trying to do is break down the silos and truly create an energy that will move our students to the forefront. And you can look at the platform. I don't want to take time on that, but what I want to share is that as Grant and his group is starting a movement, we've tried to start a movement this year in December called Minovate. And Minovate is an opportunity to bring all constituents together to work on behalf of children. We had a kickoff event in December. We had over 100 people registered to come from all walks of life in Minnesota. And of course, what happened? We had a major snowstorm and we're in a winter storm warning. We still had about 75 people attend. And it was a great conversation. We're now taking that conversation. Our association has 9 regions. We're going to take that conversation out to every one of the regions. Yesterday, we set up the tentative dates for 7 of the regions. We're going to finalize the other 2 regions. And the goal is to engage people in conversation. It's exactly what Grant talked about. How can we come together? How can we come together on behalf of children? And so we don't have all the answers. We are here to learn. Our members, I can guarantee you, care deeply about the students that they work with. And I believe that all of us could be more successful working with children if truly we could create a common agenda and support each other through that implementation. With that, again, I want to thank Grant and the members of the committee for allowing us to be here, and look forward to responding to your questions after the other distinguished colleagues give their presentations. Thank you.
Want to thank Grant, Mayor Frazier, and other members of the Achievement Gap Committee Task Force for the invitation for us to participate in this conversation, and also to thank you for the work you've done for several years now, highlighting the effects of the achievement gap and trying to float ideas for how to overcome it and close it. So thank you, and then thank you also for the invitation to participate.
So, back and forth.
Thank you very much. As Grant mentioned, I'm with the Minnesota Business Partnership, and some people may wonder, who is the Minnesota Business Partnership? Our members are the leaders of the state's 114 largest employers. They employ about 400,000 Minnesotans and 2 million people worldwide. In addition, our member companies and their foundations are actively contributing to Minnesota's development. And some of the companies and foundations include Cargill, General Mills, Target, 3M, Medtronic, and in Greater Minnesota, Federated Insurance, the Mayo Clinic, Red Wing Shoe, just to name a few. And you might ask, why are our members concerned about the achievement gap in Minnesota? Well, they're Minnesota-based employers, and they compete in a global environment, global economy, in which each year the educational expectations for new employees are rising every year. It's increasingly competitive, and for Minnesota-based employers to succeed, we have to make sure that our citizens are educated at a level that's competitive globally. And that, in turn, can help sustain our quality of life in Minnesota. One of Grant's questions, let's see if I do this right. Yes, thank you, was how do we see the achievement gap? Historically, Minnesota's K-12 system has been recognized as one of the best in the country. And even on international evaluations, like the TIMSS exams that we take every 4 years, Minnesota comes out strong. But unfortunately, as you start to dig into the numbers, as you all have done, you start to realize that Minnesota's overall performance masks the depths of our achievement gaps. And these are not new. There have been reports to the legislature dating back to 1988, highlighting the emerging achievement gaps. And again, on the overall basis, as you can see, for overall and white students, you know, the first category is the percent of students that are at or above grade level in reading and math, 4-year high school graduation rates, the unemployment and poverty rates, and as you maybe heard or read in today's paper about the Met Council report, you know, overall, Minnesota does very well compared to the nation as a whole. But it's when you dig down a little bit deeper that you start to see the achievement gaps for Asian students, Hispanic, African American. And I would like to mention that over the last 10 plus years, these numbers reflect improvements. We have had improvements in performance. Unfortunately, if you will, the improvements between white students and students of color have been relatively parallel. And the key, obviously, is to help students of color advance more quickly. But today, from our perspective, what the achievement gap looks like is we have less than 40% of students of color who can read and do math at grade level. About half, a little bit less, graduate in high school in 4 years. And those educational achievement gaps directly translate to economic opportunity gaps. This keeps our members up at night. 20 years ago, we had 6% students of color. Today, it's 27%, and it's growing. And again, as Minnesota-based employers who are dependent on Minnesota students and graduates who are able to compete on a global basis, again, these numbers keep us up at night. So the question is, what can we do? That still works, great. Generally, at the statewide level, we follow 4 guiding principles when looking at educational policies. And the first one is set rigorous world-class academic standards or expectations for all students. And I want to emphasize all. It's really a critical equity position from our perspective. The second one is measure and report student progress, both at the student and school level, so we know how we're doing. The third and fourth work together. The third is we want to make sure educators have the flexibility to design educational programs that they think will work best for the students they serve. And the fourth then is we want families to have the choice of the schools that they think will best meet their kids' needs. And in the big picture, what we're trying to accomplish with this is a blending or a matching of teaching skills and learning styles. We need to customize as best we can. A one-size approach one size fits all doesn't work. When we look at individual school levels, we found that schools that are most effective at eliminating achievement gaps and raising overall performance, they share 5 common characteristics. And these characteristics are very similar to the ones actually that the committee identified a few years ago with 1 or 2 differences. But in general, effective schools have a leader that not only can build their team but create a culture of success. They have teachers and staff who are committed to the school's mission and strategies. And they have ongoing professional development opportunities. Teachers' instruction is carefully aligned with standards, and they regularly, frequently assess their students' progress. So if someone's falling behind, they're not getting it, they can intervene right away rather than let them continue to drift behind. Fourth, they have strategies for engaging parents and families. And fifth, they try to create as much instructional time as possible. And I just would like to highlight, I won't mention it other than just to mention it, is on the back of our sheet was another quote that the task force highlighted a couple years ago from the Education Trust. And it basically said, schools that serve concentrations of low income and/or students of color have to get all of these things right. You can't be sloppy about 1 or 2 things and just let it ride. You have to be very intentional and careful to pay attention to the details. Give this another shot. I'm going to focus a little bit on the next question Grant had us try to respond to. I'm going to reverse it a little bit. Where are there areas of agreement? Rather than at this point, what are some of our barriers? I think generally speaking, and these are areas where agreement is growing. We may not all be there yet, but I think there's progress being made. And I'll piggyback on Chris Stewart's comment from last week. But the first one is the common belief that all kids can succeed and can get to expectations that will allow them to be prepared for success after high school, that achievement is not dependent on race, culture, income. And again, our state standards are a description of where kids need to be when they graduate, so they're prepared either for career entry or post-secondary ed. The next broad area I think there's building consensus on, and it's not surprising that this and the next one are about the people in our schools. One is that we need great leaders. Leadership is critical at building that culture of success and in a supportive environment, not only for staff, but for students. And that we need to attract and develop and retain great leaders. I won't go into the details, but at the end of the next 3 slides, there's some recommendations, things that we're pursuing this legislative session. But I think the focus is, broadly speaking, there's agreement that we need to focus on leadership capacity. The next one, not surprisingly, is teachers. I think we'll all agree that teachers are the most important in-school factor for determining student success. And again, this means we need to attract, develop, and retain the best we can, the most effective teachers. And again, not to get into details, but a couple of the things that we look forward to working with Gary and Jennifer and other organizations. I think Gary said very well, not just education organizations, but community-based organizations as well. It's a broad challenge that can't be done just by one group or one set. But I think, again, the capacity of leaders and teachers in our schools, it's inescapable. To do better, we have to find the best, develop them, and keep them. And the third area, I think, is about the availability of public information. Parents need information on how their children are doing. The public needs information on how their schools are doing. And again, the backbone for this information, the only information that's comparable across the state, are the results on the state's MCAs or tests. Parents need to know, is my child on track for meeting expectations? Will they graduate from high school prepared for post-secondary or career? And the public needs to know, where are best practices occurring? Where can we help some schools that are maybe struggling and get those conversations working? And again, we have a couple recommendations. One I just mentioned dovetails off of Gary's with the Parent Aware Early Ed Scholarships. I want to congratulate and thank Senator Uyghur for his leadership again last year, and I think Frank Forsberg is here with Mini Minds, all their work to get those scholarships to help low-income families access effective early ed providers. We want to work to make those. There was a hard cap at $5,000 per child adopted last year. $5,000 will probably work for most families, but undoubtedly there'll be some families that need more. And we'd just like to get rid of that hard cap to create the flexibility so that we can fully address the needs of all families. Let's see. Again, I just want to come back to this in the sense that I think we have growing consensus that to help our students better, perform more effectively, we need to look at school leaders, teachers, and getting information out to parents. And frankly, I think there's been more activity going on at the community or non-legislative level to recognize the achievement gap and do things about it. For example, in Minnesota, each year there's about $250 million, with a B, $billion in educational philanthropy for education, and that does not include volunteers, mentors, and materials. And over the last few years, we've had groups like Generation Next come together, now being led by R.T. Ryback. Another group, Education Transformation Initiative, or ETI. Our efforts to pull and align community resources to focus on what's working and how do we build off of what's working. Can we be more coordinated on that, and also with a sense of urgency? Again, as we look at these numbers, they're better than they were 10 years ago, but at the rate we're improving, our quality of life is severely jeopardized and we'll be in danger of falling behind. Other efforts that are going at the community level, our members are working with effective charter schools in Minneapolis. We want to see are there things we can do to expand the number of kids they serve. And then not just in the Twin Cities, but in greater Minnesota. You have communities in Rochester and elsewhere, some working with the Blandin Foundation that are focused on the achievement gap and early learning. So we tend to think about this as a metro issue. It's really, we need to remember it's a Minnesota issue, and there's a lot of stuff going on, thankfully. And again, to your other question about what are some of the barriers, one of the issues I think was brought up at last week's meeting. Too often when we talk about reform initiatives, one group sees, if we get this, another group sees, we lose that. It's a zero-sum game. And I think that's really a destructive practice, because if we really think about why we're making the changes, it's not to advantage one group over another group of adults. Hopefully we're doing it to better serve kids. And sometimes that's not always front and center. The other, I think we sometimes struggle at the state level about that common belief about can all kids learn? Maybe we say, yes, all kids can learn, but then we really struggle. Well, to what point do we mean that by? Is it high school graduation expectations, or is it something more or something less? And then change is always difficult. We're comfortable with what we have and what we've grown up with. We have pockets where change is occurring and making progress, and a good example of that is digital learning. I have a feeling that that's going to occur non-legislatively before legislatively, but we'll get there. And then kind of on the brighter note, the partnership recognizes each year 2 high-performing, high-poverty schools, one in the metro, one in greater Minnesota. And as part of that process, we talk with the teachers and ask them, what do you do that helps your students to be so successful? And one of the schools we visited with is up by the Red Lake Indian Reservation. And at the time, their students were not making adequate yearly progress. The schools were on the cusp of having to do some corrective actions under No Child Left Behind. And in talking to the teachers, they kind of said to themselves, you know, we can do better than this. And we really don't want the state to come in and tell us how we have to improve ourselves. They know their kids, they know what they need, what they respond to. And so as a team in the school, they got together and they made changes to their curriculum and instructional practices, how they structured the day. And within a few years, they turned things around and were one of the highest performing schools in the state. And that kind of told us two things. One, we don't have an achievement gap because of the kids. They can meet any expectations we set. And the other message it gave us was that when adults get together to figure out what works best for kids and makes those necessary changes, good things happen. So it's, we're optimistic, occasionally frustrated, but optimistic, and always trying to keep in mind those numbers. And we share Gary's urgency, and we got to change this now. Thank you.
So I'm going to go through an explanation of who MMEP is, and in doing so, explaining some of our efforts, then I think we're getting to the how do we understand the gap and what do we propose should shift. Many of you, who here is a member of MMEP? Raise your hand. Ooh, we need more members. So this is a membership-based organization, and our goal really is to work collectively with educators, community members, students, families, and others around the state to increase the success of students of color. And I'm really proud to be a part of MMEP because of its legacy. Ron McKinley, who passed away, founded the organization. And at the time, in the 80s, we were the first ones to say we have a community of color growing, and our Native American students with amazing talents, but the system's not meeting their talents. And so I feel like that's probably a part of my own value system, is that I truly believe in all the cultural communities have contributed to building this society, and globally, if you look at it as well. And really, it's our systems that are failing. So it is about opportunity gaps. So in order to answer this question, we have to understand what the problem is. And for us, it just rolls off of our tongue that this is really a systemic issue, structural issue, and cultural issue. And when I say culture, I want to be really careful to explain that the culture within schools, the culture in our society of looking at young black men and their role in schools, it's that culture that I'm talking about. It's racism. So it's a systemic and cultural issue that we have to address. And Dr. Ron Ferguson out of Harvard, who's looked at lots of districts and lots of things that are working around the country, has also clarified that in his own text, Toward Excellence with Equity, that in the context of a movement for excellence with equity, we have to view all this as changing those cultural norms and a collective action process that nobody does anything by themselves, right? You have youth organizations, you have teachers, you have schools, you have chambers, corporations that all have to shift. So I think one thing I want folks to remember when we leave the room is we do have to go, we have to move beyond blaming. It's Superintendent X's fault. But I would say in a race-based society like ours, we're blaming communities of color and families quite a bit more than we are corporations. So just remember that we look at the news, look at how we portray, especially our young men of color. And I'll talk about that focus in a moment, why we're doing that focus. And so how do we know we've closed the gap? At the end of the day, we know we'll close when race is no longer a predictor of success. I encourage everybody to please read the latest book, The New Jim Crow, about how much systemic racism exists. It's like, it was caked in, now it's really like cemented in, right? And so we know what the outcome typically would be of a young black man in our society. And really, I hope the State of the Union says something about it tonight, because it's in a crisis mode, seriously. And another piece that I want folks to remember, I love that we brought up the economic outcome, right? We have these gaps, they're persistent, and oh my God, this is the demographic shift, and oh my God, how are we going to pay for services in this country? But the other loss is to cultural communities. So in other words, what would this community have been like if our executive director, Carlos Mariani, had never gone to Macalester? What would this community be like if Matthew Little weren't involved in the movement? That to me is what keeps me up at night, based on my history and my personal heritage and my family that came to this country and was educated and contributes back. And I always list for folks the examples of cultural leaders, kind of the bicultural leadership that we have in this country that we're so blessed to have. Winona LaDuke and what she's done with White Earth and what she's also shown public policy leaders. And this astronaut, Jose Hernandez, I encourage you to look up his story, his bio, of how much he was so persistent in becoming part of NASA, and then showing the Latino community that we can be involved in the STEM fields and contribute back to our community. So if anything, the economic cost is huge, but the cultural, moral ramifications is even larger for a democratic society that is as multicultural as ours. So how does MAP propose working on this? I love all the literature that says, these nonprofits were so silly trying to think we're going to solve the problem, with my staff of 4, and half of those students, graduate students practically. So we work collaboratively on this, right? And many of you have been a part of our research projects, our policy papers. Please pick up our Citizens of Color report and ask for some very specific papers we have on cultural community specifically. We have networks where we encourage people to join the College Access Network we have and the Solutions Not Suspensions campaign we're building. And then, of course, we advocate. So we sit around a lot of tables that are pushing for public policies and considering new solutions from a systemic level. So I want to elaborate on our papers. Just want to say something about our College Access Network. This was actually part of a movement that started before President Obama was elected. Prior to that, there was a huge movement of how do we get more kids accessing college, and then now it's to the success part. I think what's been great about our College Access Network, which now has over 500 members, is that it includes, like I said, churches, school systems, cultural communities, the Urban League, CLUES, folks like that are all contributing their part to the story, providing students in culturally specific ways information about college, and then working with higher ed institutions to make sure those students succeed. I'd say that one big learning in terms of what we could propose from what we've learned from this process is definitely colleges building with K-12 systems this pathway, which I think is where we're headed towards, would ensure that we know where, especially, again, those left behind the most, Native American students or African American young men, if we know at 9th grade or 10th grade what their interests are, and we can have that preparation start earlier for them in college, then we take away this dropout, possibility, because they're already on a path, because that 9th grade, 10th grade teachers and instructors have actually shaped that pathway for them. So we definitely are looking into supporting more of the K-12 to college continuum. In our Solutions Not Suspensions campaign, I would ask who here is a part of our campaign, but I hope after you hear me, you will all be a part of our campaign. We have a Twitter party today at 4 o'clock. So you look up our Twitter handle at MMEP Race Equity. And what we're trying to build with that and with the entire campaign is this awareness that our black boys specifically are 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled from our schools. And when you look at the cause of that, and this is something that we want to shift from a local level all the way to a state level, is we have not modernized our discipline policies. So we're part of a Dignity in Schools campaign nationally, and Secretary Arne Duncan has already made the statement that we all need to revise these policies to be able to really get at problems, why we're using that suspension, intervention. And in fact, actually doing away with it when it comes to the younger grades. So we're looking nationwide at kindergartners also being highly suspended, especially with specific groups. So we're trying to address that from a policy level. The cultural level is that youth of color and their parents, they're pissed off, They know who's continually being kicked out, generations of students and their families, and they want to see these policies shift. I'll give some credit right now to Minneapolis Public Schools who reshaped their discipline code, and also the St. Paul schools. So MMEP is partnering with those districts to show a model of community engagement that then relays back how families feel about the new policies. And then the work that I'm very intimately involved with is the Race Equity and Excellence Network. That's a rural Minnesota focus on race equity. What we're doing here is a collective impact project. You've all heard about Strive and other Cradle to Career efforts. We partnered with Mary Sam, Ojibwe Mille Lacs Band member, who has connected us to leaders and system leaders, school board members, school leaders. To develop a Cradle to Career project, we'll be unleashing a race equity plan, we call it, that will include recommendations for their own race equity policies shifting, and also some ideas of implementing closing the gap strategies. I want to show you guys this model. The top part is a typical Cradle to Career framework that you'll see, and Strive talks a lot about looking at the early childhood levels all the way through 12th grade and beyond. The orange blocks are this question, of how family, how community feels about that. And so our process in the Race Equity Network that we're building, our process involves asking community, what do you envision as success for the educational system? And when we did this with the families and others, these were the orange blocks is what they expected. High expectations, engaging in language and cultural pride, so teaching the language, Ojibwe language. Civic engagement, they want their children to come out, not just with the ability to get a good job, but the ability to contribute back to their community. And so with all that, we really talk about infusing the system with that central part of how families see what they'd like to see improved. And the last piece of work I'll talk about is we are also trying to build the next generation of advocates. If you look at a lot of our ed reform movements, and even our educators, it is still predominantly white in Minnesota. And so we're trying to encourage people to become policy analysts, people from communities of color, and look at the research and be involved in this process so that we start to see a more diverse level of decision makers in education reform. So that is our last project. Our boss, Carlos Mariani, Executive Director and representatives, texted me about 2 minutes before we started this, and he said, make sure the folks know that we believe in an inside-outside strategy. In other words, we're very involved with community. We could tell you what small groups are doing, what the Dreamers are doing right now, the DREAM Act students, and we could tell you how our legislators and our Commissioner of Education feel about those issues. And we really love that space that we could kind of walk in between. But we do need other systems to think that way, to have those smaller meetings with our Native students or families of color. Young black men, if you belong to any institution, I want you to ask them, what are you doing to find out about what young black men or young Latino men are thinking about a college pathway or the U's new whatever policy? There are certain voices in this community that we don't listen to. And then we ask ourselves why they're not involved as decision makers in the end. And so I'll leave you with the last kind of philosophical thought for the next speaker, but we believe in this philosophy that our American institutions have to start to ask themselves profoundly multicultural questions. Profoundly multicultural questions. So with that.
I'm the Education Equity Pilot Rubric Project Coordinator, and I work for the Organizing Apprenticeship Project, OAP, as it's popularly known, which is a social justice institution. The main work that we do is advancing the equity agenda throughout the state of Minnesota and sometimes beyond. And so OAP convened what we call the Education Equity Organizing Collaborative, which is a collaborative of 10 institutions, and we currently have the first cohort that is engaged in the pilot rubric project has 4 school districts, and currently 12 community groups also engaged in the pilot project. And we also are partnering with the Minnesota Department of Education and the Great Lakes Equity Center. And I just want to mention the organizations that are partners in the collaborative project, and that is the African American Leadership Forum, the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial Committee, CAPI, which is the Center for Asians and Pacific Islanders, although they just go by CAPI now because they serve more than that population, the Coalition of Black Churches, Central Campesino, HASA, Hope Community, Isaiah, Migizi Communications, Somali Action Alliance, Think Small, and of course the Organizing Apprenticeship Project. And I'll talk a little bit more about the project towards the end, but I'm going to delve straight into today's subject matter. So I apologize, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. However, I will be more than happy to send the information that I talk about to the organizers, and then they can make it accessible. And then also the Education Equity Pilot Project. I think it's a great project, and if you would like to learn more about it, you can go to our website, which is www.oaproject.org. So I will just go straight to answer some of the questions. So what do we understand to be the problem of the achievement gap? I am going to start with one of my very favorite quotes, and I'm sure a lot of you probably have already heard it, but I'm going to go ahead and read it again anyway. So Bradley Scott in We Should Not Kid Ourselves, Excellence Requires Equity says that, let us admit that in order for schools to be called excellent, exemplary, blue ribbon, or models, they must work for all kinds of diverse learners. They must be producing high student outcomes for all learners regardless of race, gender, national origin, and linguistic status and economic status. If they are, they may be, if they're not, they may be good, but they're not excellent. After all, good schools have always worked for some students. The real issue is making schools work for all students. So in coming up with the Education Equity Pilot Rubric Project, that is what we believe. That is how we understand the achievement gap to be. We understand the achievement gap to be an equity issue. The achievement gap in Minnesota is greatest along racial lines. So we consider it to be a social justice issue. In fact, we think it is one of the greatest social justice issues of our time. For most people of color, and especially immigrants, a good education is mostly one of the only way that one can propel themselves upwards economically. And so not having access to a good quality education really predetermines how people's future is going to be. We live in a country where you live matters, because where you live predetermines where you go to school, and also in turn the quality of education that you're going to receive. And unfortunately, in most cases, what this has meant for low-income students of color is that they're going to underserved schools, and therefore this already predetermines what their future is going to look like just by default of where they live. So one of the greatest problems that we see is that, and currently there's a raging debate about Minnesota's persistent gaps in education outcomes, and we think that sometimes there's a basic truth that is missed in this conversation, and that is that the current education system is not working well for students of color. The current education system is not working well for students of color, and we come from the premise that says students should be able to walk into any school, and all schools should be ready to serve every student. So racially and economically predictable disparities in academic outcomes, graduation rates, disproportional rates in discipline, and other indicators are all symptoms that point to us that there is a deeper problem in our education system. We also believe that there are persistent institutional barriers for us achieving education equity. The ways in which we measure excellence in education tends to look more to outcomes and does not take into consideration the barriers that exist for some people in our community, and especially some students in our community. So it tends to look at the outcomes than equity, and so we concentrate more on outcomes instead of working towards equity. How do we achieve equity in terms of everything that we do, whether it's providing education and et cetera, and also all other things that would be able to support a good quality education environment for students, whether it's in the schools or at home. So in terms of what do we believe needs to be done to address the achievement gap, we believe that closing gaps requires leadership from multiple community stakeholders, and this includes the district leaders, the students, and students of color in this case, because most of the disparities are along color lines. And we also believe that parents, students, and community members have to be involved in the process. The process must intentionally, the focus is on the word intentional. We have to be very intentional about focusing on equity as a goal towards creating, equitable schools and schools where everybody can achieve, regardless of where they come from. And to their credit, and also in the process of doing this work, already there are some districts across this state that are beginning to build equity into their systems. And so we need to highlight the work that the school districts, the initiative that some school districts are already taking. We believe that by putting equity first, we will develop meaningful solutions and close gaps in opportunities and outcomes for all Minnesotan students. The other point also is that we need a holistic approach on how we address the issue. And so, once again, we believe that everyone has a role to play. There are many creative ideas and initiatives, and we need to bring all those ideas together and stop working in our different silos. We also believe that there needs to be a systemic change in addressing this problem. We believe that the system has a role to play because the system is also failing our children of color. So there needs to be a systemic change and not just policy changes in addressing this issue. The Education Equity Rubric Project, we believe, takes a holistic approach to the issue of achievement and opportunity gap through 8 equity goals. The rubric asks key questions that assess equity progress and allow stakeholders to address barriers and other key components of the equity rubric. So our approach is that we have a community-led and driven approach towards addressing this issue because we believe that communities of color are the experts on what their experiences are, and they're the experts in knowing what it is that they require, and therefore have to be at the forefront of coming up with the solutions that are going to make their children more successful. We believe that stakeholders at the table include those most affected by barriers, that is, students and families of color. We believe that building equity requires leadership from the top to the people who receive the services from the schools, in addition to the communities. All equity inquiry teams in this project include both of these components in the work that we're doing. We also know that building equity requires time and commitment, emphasis being on the word commitment. It is so easy to come up, like we're working on the equity project, rubric project, and everybody is very excited about it, and a lot of people want to be a part of it. As the coordinator, my big question is about sustainability. How much commitment are people going to put into this project is a big issue. So the rubric is an ongoing process, and if we stop being intentional about building equity, we will lose our progress, because we want to acknowledge that some progress has been made so far. But again, commitment in continuing to build this momentum and even going deeper, to coming up with solutions is very key to this, to the issue. So what do we believe are the barriers to ending the achievement gap? Of course, we believe that there are many barriers to this. We believe that the disparate education outcomes grow out of complex. We will acknowledge that many of the barriers that are in place are often unintended. And once again, that is why we have to be intentional about addressing those barriers. We also believe that there's a problem in how the issue is framed. And a big part of it stems from who is framing the issues, who is telling the story, who is crafting the narrative to begin with. Is it the people who are most affected by the issue, or is it being crafted externally? So in our case, in fact, we prefer to name it the opportunity gap. We do not call it the achievement gap. We call it the opportunity gap because we feel that there's an opportunity that is being missed. It's not so much that the students are not achieving, but we believe that they're not accessing the same opportunities that would enable them to achieve. And so we name it the opportunity gap. So let us start from the opportunity aspect first, and not just opportunity, but access to that opportunity before we even start measuring the achievement. We need to take into consideration all things being equal. How would these students achieve? There is also a great need for cultural change. So in our experience, we believe that you can come up with the greatest policies. However, it is very difficult to legislate behaviors and cultures in institutions. And so every institution needs to examine itself and realize that there needs to be a cultural change and a cultural shift. For example, we believe that all students can achieve. Now we have to create cultures in our institutions where this is a belief and that everybody is acting in that way, that everybody carries a culture in them, that every student who walks through their doors every morning is able to achieve. We also need education environments that speak to the children, in them who attend the institutions with history, culture, and language that is relevant to their lives. We need to move from a deficit narrative to an opportunity narrative. We need to have expectations of all children in our community and in our state of Minnesota. So some of the agreements among the reform proposals of the participating organizations, we believe that the education rubric project does not center on any one silver bullet. So we believe that all solutions are important. On our part, our solution centers on addressing the issue of institutional racism. So it is very important for us to name racism as a key factor because, once again, like I said, when you look at the disparities, the greatest disparities are along racial lines. So we have to name institutional racism as a factor, and we have to be intentional about addressing institutional racism when it comes to educational inequities. We also seek to integrate all stakeholders, owning both the problems, so we all have to own the problems and the solutions. What is critical is that communities of color are included in the solution-making process. We also need parent leadership in the process. And when I talk about parent leadership, it's not to put the burden on the parents. We also have to be very creative in how we make parent leadership available. I think parents, and as a parent, I can speak for myself, we're very concerned about our children's education, and we're more than willing to participate. But we need for these educational institutions to be, to provide that access to us so that we're not just consulted when our kids are in trouble, but so if our kids are performing well, how do we even sustain that so that they can continue to be successful? We also believe that there should be a transformative process. I mean, of course, by coming up with the education equity pilot rubric, we believe that that is a transformative process. We have set out on a very ambitious agenda to create education equity towards in the whole state, in the state of Minnesota. And so, because we do believe that education equity can be achieved, and that is the other point I want to make. We have to truly believe that we can achieve education equity, or else we shouldn't talk about it to begin with. We have to believe that every child can achieve, or else we should not even be talking about it if that is not a firm belief that we carry within ourselves. I will emphasize again about systemic change, because when I talk about systemic change, I'm not just talking about the educational system, but I think we also have to be very creative in how we think about education as a system and realize all the other different institutions that affect the education system, and also seek to collaborate with other institutions, even though they're not educational institutions, when they're addressing other systemic changes, because those systems do affect the education system. For example, issues around disproportionate incarceration rates, issues around housing issues, because where you live, once again, is very important. The other systemic change that needs to happen, where you live should not really determine what type of an education that you get. So on our end, when we talk about choice, we want to talk, there's something we call real choices. Because as a parent, for example, we hear a lot being talked about education choice, but what is a real choice? A real choice means that all things being equal, I would still choose to take my child to another school. Okay, so when we talk about education choice, let us consider the fact that if everything was being offered in this school, would I as a parent choose to take my child to an alternative school? And if that is not the truth, then that is not a true choice. It is a false choice. In a great sense, I am being forced to look for a better alternative because I do not have a good alternative next to where I live. So I will end with that. And once again, information about the education rubric can be accessed on the website, or else I can talk a little bit more about it and about the inquiry team and et cetera during the question and answer session.
Thank you, Delima. Jeffrey Canada has pointed out that because of an opportunity gap, in order for students to be able to really have the ability to catch up over time, you really have to have more time on task. And so Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone has the kids in school for 200 days. They're their longer days. They provide after-school enrichment for children there that don't have the opportunities of wealthier students. I know Superintendent Silva has told me that when we talk about adding time, it's about $1 million a day in St. Paul. If we are truly serious about eliminating the opportunity gap, are we as a state willing to provide extra opportunity for children who do not have those opportunities so they have a much better chance of erasing the achievement gap?
So, I mean, I think, so on our part, I think I said before that we approach this as an equity issue. And so what equity to us means that equity is different from equality. Equality means that you give everybody the same, the same thing. If you're giving everybody $100, then you give everybody $100. Equity means that you give everybody what they need. So if other people need $1 million to close that opportunity gap and other people don't need the $1 million, then that is what happens, that the people who need $1 million to close that opportunity gap get to have that $1 million, and that is what equity means to us.
I'm glad you mentioned Harlem Children's Zone, because that's actually where I use the kind of the research behind the Cradle to Career that I showed you, is the process they went through with the families to get to their model. And I would say that we need to think, especially if you're not an educator and you're a policymaker or leader of a community, we need to start building opportunity communities. So what does that mean? You know there's a gap in your city, and you know you have a ton of resources in that city, including universities. How many universities are in the Twin Cities region? Just like the most of any metro area in the country. You also have churches with different ethnic communities attending them. Creatively, those are sites that provide additional opportunity. They can work with Latino families around third grade literacy, or they can work with African American families around the discipline gap issue, empowering parents to know the policies. So I think there's a situation, the policymakers would love this, where maybe we don't need more money, we need a reframing of the role of everybody to close the gap. And then you create those opportunity communities. Read the best story about Jeffrey Kennedy is Whatever It Takes, I believe, Paul Tufts' book. And it just talks how they walk through that story. And follow their website. Follow how chambers get involved. Follow how Goldman Sachs, or I don't know what corporations, help support it. That's the mobilization we need to happen. That would happen.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is actually, I want to ask a question to all of you. First of all, I want to point out the question I asked has actually come around again, was somebody with the most beautiful handwriting I've ever seen. I don't know, I mean, this is great. Remember, some of us are old enough where we used to have to take handwriting. My God, thank you. This is beautiful. But it had to do with this whole question of extra time and things. But here's sort of the chicken and egg problem that we have. It really is a crisis right now for us in this state to be able to apply the most effective resources we can to solve this problem as quickly as we can. How do we balance that in a state that seems to be reluctant to raise resources? For example, Jim, you talked about increasing the limit on the parent-aware, the early childhood scholarships. Is there a sense that corporations and others in this community are willing to step in there and say, we're willing to provide the resources if you're willing to be held accountable? Is that there, or are we saying we got to do this with the resources we got, that's just the way it is?
I think there are a couple answers there. First, in terms of foundation support for our schools and education generally, I think it's good to back up and realize that each year there's $250 million currently given to the educational system in this state. We're one of the most generous states in the country. I think that's also, though, one of the reasons you're seeing groups like Generation Next and ETI form, in the sense that there's been a lot of resources provided without a great sense that they're being provided to the most effective programs, or that there aren't, an overload of contributions to this effort and a huge gap over here. So I think over the last several years there's been a strong effort to try and get a better understanding of where are philanthropic dollars going? Are they going to the most effective programs? Do we have gaps in the system existing currently? And a redirection of those, try to align those. I know Frank's here with Generation Next, but are we looking at early learning opportunities or graduating from high school, college, and career ready? There's a significant investment, and we need to find out who's doing a good job in those particular areas and build off of those. It's kind of the time discussion we just had, in the sense that more time is needed, and I'm on the board of a charter school that provides about 30% more time for their students. But that doesn't mean just more time and doing the same thing. You also have to be very, again, constructive and intentional with how you use that time. You don't just do more of what you've been doing for 30%. And you also look at how you can undo some of the things that interrupt the school day that aren't instructional. So the short answer is, I think people are open. They do want to have that conversation about this is being requested and this is the outcome that's being proposed, and how do you measure whether or not that's occurring. So there's been a very serious conversation about that the last few years.
Great. Gary?
In talking about resources, I think it's important to frame that our Constitution in the state of Minnesota says that the state is responsible for providing, and I'm not going to use the exact words, so I apologize, but adequate, fair resources, equitable resources. That's the responsibility of our state. And if you take the 10 years prior to this current legislative session, we all know we had an economic downturn in the country and in the state. And what occurred with our general funding in the state was that we had an increase of about 50% of the rate of inflation. And that's not to blame anybody, it's a reality that I think we just have to understand. The economy was struggling, and we had an inflationary rate increase, and we had dollars that covered 50% of it. That would be like saying if your mortgage went up 30% and your income went up 15%, you still had to cover that 30% increase. And so you begin to eat away at what you were doing. And so we were very fortunate that the economy is starting to recover. This last legislative session, Senator Uyghur and his colleagues, we have an increase in funding for schools with additional accountability. I don't believe there's a superintendent in the state of Minnesota who does not want to be held accountable for what needs to be done. Where I think we still have a challenge in our state is, what is it that we believe needs to be done? At times, it changes every 2 years. At times, it changes every 4 years based on the legislation that comes out of St. Paul. That's a reality. I'm not casting stones. I'm just saying it's difficult at times to have that focus when that focus is changing every 2 to 4 plus years. We now have the world's best workforce legislation that was adopted last May. So there's another entire accountability system that we now embrace. It calls for things to happen over time. We have an election coming up in November of 2014. We have a governor that's up for re-election. We have our entire House of Representatives in the state that's up for re-election. If there's a shift in who sits in the chairs in January of 2015, will we still have the world's best workforce as our target, or will there be a change in the target? And I think that causes us a lot of challenge. We're not afraid to be held accountable, but it's a more challenging situation when the target keeps moving on us.
Gary, there's another question really quickly, to say a little bit more about Minnovation.
Sure. And I heard my colleagues at the table And I know our colleagues at the Chamber, and I know other organizations are I know Education Minnesota, are convening conversations around the state, trying to draw in constituents to determine what do we all think's best for our children. And what Minovate is that opportunity. We invited over 200 members of our state, private sector, public sector, parents, business, industry, educators from all different, levels of the field. And we wanted to begin the conversation about what do we believe is necessary for our children to be successful in the 21st century. Do we have skill sets that we know we need? We had Secretary of State Ritchie present that day to talk about the vision of the workforce in the next 20 years. And what we were trying to do is begin to have the conversation about what is that outcome that we can agree upon for our children. And then based on what we agree upon, then how do we build the system that needs to get us there? And it doesn't mean that what we're currently doing is bad. We're just trying to gain consensus. We're now going to take those conversations out to our 9 regions. And again, engage all the various constituents about, can we come to an agreement on what the outcome needs to be for all of our children? And I believe that you've got 12 organizations having this conversation. You're going to have 12 different variations of a message. Where can we come together on that message for all children? And that's what the conversation's about. It's as much about drawing people in and trying to gain common ground as anything. We always believe that conversation's a good thing, and trying to have people understand each other's perspectives and gain a consensus we think is a good direction.
Go ahead, Jim.
Just a quick thought. A lot of the conversation, I guess I'd ask us to see first if we could agree on what the desired outcomes we want from our educational system to be. Where do we want kids to be? And then I guess I'd ask us to think, what's the best way to get there? Because I think a lot of the times we presume that the way we're going to get there is with the way we've been doing it already, with current structures in place. I think the last biennial budget for K-12 education is $15.7 billion. The nearly $500 million, depending on who you talk to, was just enough to keep pace with where we needed to be. But aside from the fiscal issues, the world is rapidly changing. Digital instruction is happening. It's blowing up all around us. It's going to change our instructional practices. There are folks in the room who are very interested and supportive of teacher-led schools. Changes, I guess I did just invite us to think about, are there other ways to get to where we need our kids to be? And not look at the system we have today and say we need to add X onto it and Y onto it to hope this whole system moves forward. But at the same time, we need to be flexible enough to think, are there alternatives out there that are working elsewhere, whether it's self-governed schools, charters, or otherwise, or digital learning, that are fundamentally going to change the way school looks and operates for our kids? So just a bit of a challenge in that regard as well.
This last question is, and this the last one, because I think it's almost 1:30 right now, and it's a tough one. We talk about having high expectations for all our students. But we have to admit in this state that we have an overwhelming education profession that is white and has not shown itself for the last 30 years to be really successful at making sure those high standards are met by the students they're teaching. So it's an issue, I'm sort of combining equity and race in terms of this one thing we all agree on. There have to be these very high standards for all our students. How, I suppose, Gary, in your organization, how is capacity being built? How is transformation happening in the districts so they're taking seriously perhaps, why for so many years they have not been able to have children of color and children in poverty succeed at the level that they believe they should be able to succeed at? What's going on?
What's going on?
I'd like to respond too.
I would love you to start the response.
And here, I actually feel like I have a leg up. This is, I wanted you to mention I'm an advisor for the College of Education, Human Development here. I wanted to really understand, I'm a systems person, so I wanted to understand how, this kind of box worked, right, that was producing the teachers. And boy, are there some politics around PhDs and masters and what is knowledge. And I think we're starting to realize, this is my philosophical answer and then some practical answer, that culture matters, right? And so when you look at and I wish I could point to one and say at the University of Washington, Portland, just list a school, but I can't. I would actually say Teach for America, right? Talk about doing some really innovative stuff, looking for African-American, Latino teachers. I see ads all the time that say we need a Latino coordinator to recruit TFA recruits. They just changed their policy so that Dreamers, undocumented youth in college, could become TFA students, right? Talk about systems that are really malleable to culture and race. And I thought I'd never say that about TFA. So I think that culture matters, and that I think that people are now understanding how to walk teachers and young women and white women through that question of what is your privilege. If you have a classroom of totally different kids of color, how do you approach that? How do you understand culture? How do you understand yourself and your biases? So that's very much modernized. Now it's up to our policymakers to say, we actually want to ask that, right? It fascinates me that we want to know how people instruct in terms of time on task and what do they read, but you have no requirement of how many hours of cultural competency a person has. This is the most culturally relevant, racially significant system in our society. But all we want to know is, does Sally know how the chairs line up? And how many hours did she prep that? We have to ask about their understanding of race and culture. Now, coming back to the College of Ed, I cannot speak on their behalf, but I'm understanding the politics involved in creating that kind of a system. How they develop teachers has been put out since Dewey, and so now they're trying to fix it and change it, and I see Dean Quam really challenged by that, really saying we need African-American community members involved in re-looking at this box and changing it so that our outcomes. I'll tell you, in a couple of years, I'd go to those meetings, I'd see all faculty, again, all white. About 2 years ago, the faculty completely diversified. You have people studying with an expertise in poverty, like white poverty too, teaching the next people. You see Latinos, you see African-Americans. So Dean Quam took the challenge. We need all of our systems to take that challenge. And the other practical thing I'll say is, apparently in our race equity work we're doing, and I want to share this with those around the rubric, Oregon did have a Minority Teachers Act. And so when you want to have something happen, you want to develop it, you can propose projects other states have been proposing to diversify your teacher corps.
Thank you, Jim. I think